good?
Yep.
All right, so remember, the Abraham stories are sequenced, and within the stories, there's embedded a pattern, and generally the stories follow a pattern. God tells Abraham to do something. Abraham is obedient. Something happens that gets in the way. That's not Abraham's fault. And then Abraham tries to solve the problem on his own, usually causes the problem to get worse. God steps in and saves him. Meanwhile, the series of stories is written to kind of, hey, you started. The series of stories is written to build the suspense. As time goes, remember you're told at the beginning 3 things that are important. Abraham is 75. His wife is barren, and Canaan is full of people. And the promise is going to be, Abraham, you're going to have a lot of kids, and you're going to have Canaan. So you're already warned at the beginning, there's all these impediments, right, in the way of the promise. As each story is told, things only get worse, because Abraham is only getting older. The people are still in the land. Sarah is. And so you're like losing patience because, wait, for crying out loud, how is this? It's building suspense that the promise can't possibly be fulfilled. Right? The stories are deliberately sequenced in that way. That doesn't mean Abraham wasn't real. That doesn't mean some of this stuff didn't happen to him. But there definitely is, the author has taken liberties with the history. Right? Remember, the religious message is always the most important thing. Telling you just historically what happened isn't good enough because you can misinterpret. When I say you, we can misinterpret. And so they are definitely spinning the stories in a way to bring us to a specific conclusion. Last time we saw where Abraham tries to solve a problem himself by having sex with his wife's maid. And his wife's requested it. Of course, he got in trouble for when she got pregnant. Sarah said, it's your fault, Abraham. It was her idea, but that's the way life goes when you're married, right? So they try all these different ways of having children, and everything. Now the problem is Abraham's wife and maid don't get along, so things are not doing too well. If you look at, I didn't have you read this, but chapter 17 is where Abraham is asked to be circumcised. And from then on, circumcision is, I talked about, circumcision was not unique to the Jews. A lot of people think that. I think the Egyptians circumcised, the Philistines, so there were some groups that did, some groups that didn't. There's a big deal made out of this later on in the book of Kings and Samuel when they're fighting against the Philistines, the uncircumcised heathen. But circumcision wasn't unique to the Jews. But it is something that did become a sign for them. And then, of course, this morning we had the reading from St. Paul, right? Let me digress a little bit here. Galatians was, we think, the second letter that Paul wrote. One of the reasons why he wrote Galatians was, initially, the early church was all Jewish. And at Pentecost, when they went out and they converted people to believe in Jesus, they were really converting their fellow Jews to believe in Jesus. They didn't see themselves as a completely separate religion right away. It wasn't until the conversion of Cornelius the centurion, where Peter baptizes him because he receives the Holy Spirit first, and that opens up the Gentile mission, but that was maybe a dozen years after Pentecost. So sometime around 50, there was the first church council in Jerusalem where they met to try to decide, how do we bring the Gentiles into the church? Because one of the questions was, in order to be a Christian, do you have to be circumcised? Now to us that sounds like a silly question, right? Because we think, of course, Judaism and Christianity are separate religions. The fact that that was a question tells us the early church did not see themselves as a totally separate religion yet. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
So they had to meet. They met around 50. Paul was there. Peter was there. big church meeting, first council, and the whole meeting was about how do we bring the Gentiles into the church, what are the rules they have to follow, and they decided at that point, you don't have to be circumcised. That's why Paul makes a comment in Galatians. They did say, and they don't have to follow the dietary laws. So two of the things that really separated Judaism from the pagan world were circumcision and dietary rules. They decided the Gentiles, they have to be validly married. And they can't eat meat offered to idols. So why was that a big deal? Most people didn't eat meat. I mean, we take it for granted. A lot of Americans that's the main part of your meal every night. That isn't the way they lived in the ancient world. Most people only got to eat meat when you went to the temple and offered a sacrifice, and then you got to eat part of the animal, so you had a big feast. You brought your friends and your family because you had to eat the meat pretty quickly because after 2 days, not too good anymore, with no refrigeration, right? So you would be invited by your friends to the temple for a feast. So they made it a rule, the Gentiles that come into the church can't go to the temple anymore and eat that meat because the animal is offered to a false god. So there were some rules they had to stick to, and other rules they didn't have to stick to. Now, as we all know, in any group, once a decision is made in the group, does everybody go along with it? No, you have people that are saying, well, we've gone too far, we've changed the rules too much. So this is why Paul wrote his letter to the Galatians. As Paul is going through and converting Gentiles to believe in Jesus, conservative Christians are coming in behind him that are still Jewish, that try to convince the people that Paul has converted, no, you do have to be circumcised, and you have to follow dietary law. So you had the conservatives who thought the council was invalid, who changed the rules to coming, and that's why Paul writes Galatians, because he's very upset that this group of people coming in, they're called the Judaizers. They're Christians, but they're Jewish Christians who believe, am I making sense? And that's why Paul writes that letter, because he's angry. The church has made a decision, but you have a conservative element, and the church is coming in behind him and trying to convince the people he's converted, no, to be a full Christian, you have to be circumcised and follow the dietary rules. And that was the occasion for the letter to the Galatians. Does that make sense to everybody? Since it was a reading today and all that, we're talking about circumcision, I thought, might as well fill you in on that one. So, look at verse, in chapter 17, look at verse 15. We're not reading the whole chapter, but just 15 through 17. God said to Abraham, as for Sarah, your wife Sarai, do not call her Sarai, her name shall be Sarah. So both Abraham and Sarah's names are changed in this chapter, because now he's circumcised, and so this name change kind of signified a different relationship with God. There are three people in the Old Testament, their names changed: Abraham, Sarah, and Jacob's name is changed to Israel. I will bless her, and I will give you a son by her. So here the promise is, no, you're going to have a kid, and it's going to be Sarah. Him also I will bless. He shall give rise to nations, and rulers of people shall issue from him. Abraham prostrated himself and laughed, as he said to himself, can a child be born to a man who's 100 years old? So again, you're told the age because it's now not possible for him to father a child. Abraham laughing is a pun. Here's where reading the story, not in the original language, we miss out. The word for laughter is almost identical to the name Isaac. Abraham's going to laugh here. In the next story, Sarah's going to laugh. So when you read this in English, we don't pick up the idea that it's significant that they're both laughing, because that's going to be the child's name. Everybody understand? And that's part of the problem when you read anything in translation. Sometimes you read some of the prophets, some of the references they make look kind of bizarre, because in Hebrew, they're punning. But you don't know that because we're reading it in English. That's one of the reasons that's, if you can read it in the original language, you pick up little things that make more sense. Okay, so let's go to Abraham's visitors, chapter 18. Right, this is the one I told you guys to read? Okay, who's going to start? Go ahead.
Abraham's visitors. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the terebinth
of Mamre,
as he sat in the entrance of his tent while the day was growing hot. Looking up, he saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them. And bowing to the ground, he said, "Sir, if I may ask you this favor, please do not go on past your servant. Let some water be brought, that you may bathe your feet and then rest yourselves under the tree."
Okay, stop for a second. At this point, we don't know if Abraham knew this was God and 2 angels. You're just told 3 visitors. Now, this would be normal hospitality. These were the expectations back then, especially among like the people that were like, everybody knows who the Bedouins are, shepherds that moved. This is what you were expected. If somebody came into your camp, you were supposed to give them a drink of water and feed them, because you were, if you walked into somebody else's camp, you would expect they would do this for you. Right, so this is, Abraham is only doing here what he should have been doing, regardless of who these people were. You're expected to show hospitality, right? It's a different culture. Like I said to the kids, can you imagine a homeless person walking by down the street and you invite them into your home and say, "Here, have a meal," and whole different culture. So don't think that Abraham knows this is God and 2 angels. As far as we know, he doesn't know that. He's just extending hospitality like you should. Does it make sense? All right, go ahead.
Now that you have come under the tree, now have you come this close to your servant, let me bring you a little food, that you may refresh yourselves, and afterward you may go on your way. Very well, they replied, do as you have said. Abraham hastened into the tent and told Sarah, "Quick, 3 seahs."
Again, a seah is a measurement. We're given measurements in the Bible, but we're not necessarily exactly sure how much a seah was, how much a cubit. Well, we saw that with Noah, right? They're given measurements, but they're not quite sure exactly how much this would have been. It doesn't really change the story. Go ahead.
Quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it and make rolls. He ran to the herd, picked out a tender, choice steer and gave it to the servant, who quickly prepared it. Then he got some curds and milk, as well as the steer that had been prepared, and set these before them. And he waited on them under the tree while they ate.
Okay, this guy makes McDonald's look slow. Everybody understands you can't kill a steer and prepare that, right? So there's, in every one of these stories, you do have kind of a fictionalized element. It's just he's showing hospitality. Does this make sense? So far, this is what you're expected to do. Bathe, feed, not a problem. All right, somebody want to pick up 9? Verse 9? So break up the reading here.
"Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "Here in the tent," he replied. One of them said, "I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah will then have a son."
Remember, Abraham is now 100.
She's 90.
Yeah, well, keep going, it gets better.
Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, just behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years, and Sarah had stopped having her menstrual period.
Okay, so you're given some really explicit, right, physical.
So
Once a woman's not having her period, she can't have kids because she's not producing Hey, always interesting to teach just a freshman in high school, because some of the kids don't even know this is the way it is, right? So it's sex ed as well as biblical ed. The point here is that humanly, it's no longer possible, right? It doesn't make sense. It's not humanly possible, and at the point at which it's not humanly possible, because we know that Abraham was capable of fathering a child at, what was it, 85 or 90, somewhere around there when he had Ishmael, right? 85, I think it was. Now it's 15 years later. Ishmael is now like 15 years old. Now Sarah's going to get pregnant even though she shouldn't be able to. Go ahead.
So Sarah laughed to herself and
Okay,
said,
there you go again. Abraham laughed in the chapter before. Now Sarah laughs, and the word Yitzhak is very similar to the word laughter.
now that I am worn out and my husband is old, am I still to have sexual pleasure? But the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, will I really bear a child, old as I am? Is anything too marvelous for the Lord to do? At the appointed time, about this time next year, I will return to you, and Sarah will have a son.
Okay. This is a theme that is going to appear a lot in the Old Testament. The barren woman, right? Isaac's wife will at first be barren. And then Jacob's wife will at first be barren. And later on, Samuel's mother is barren. And who's the guy? Talk about senior moments. Samson's mother will be barren, right? There's a theme that runs through. It's to heighten the idea that the child that's born has to be special. It has to be the hand of God. In other words, right? It has to be the hand of God. Until you get to John the Baptist, whose mother is barren, right? Okay, go ahead.
Sarah lied, saying, I did not laugh, because she was afraid. But he said, yes, you did.
Okay, so now Abraham is probably realizing, these aren't just three ordinary guys. There's something very unusual about these. And now he may realize this is the Lord and angels. Okay, now it's interesting because now you're going to have, the story's going to break away into the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's like all of a sudden you have a break in the episodes. And the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is really interesting because in some ways, you can see where it's picking up a theme that all throughout the Old Testament was very troubling. Do innocent people suffer? That's a main theme that you find in the Old Testament. The whole book of Job is written really to kind of expose this problem, and then later on, of course, you have it in the Psalms, you have it in the prophets. So this is always one of those themes that constantly kind of comes back up. We saw it first in Noah's Ark, because the problem is God created the world to be good. Remember in Genesis? If the world is good, why does it seem that bad things happen to good people? Because in their mind, they don't have a concept of heaven and hell. They're thinking reward and punishment is right here. That's what makes it a real problem. So if innocent people suffer, then the problem is you would have to say God is not fair, because they're not being rewarded or punished as they should be in this life. And they wrestle. This is one of those ideas that over time definitely evolves. And they move away from they gradually move away from the notion that God always rewards and punishes fairly on this earth, and finally to the notion that the real reward and punishment must come after. Am I making sense here? So there are ideas in the Old Testament that do evolve, but they really struggle with it. And this is another one of those stories that shows that struggle. Everybody with me? So let's read the story, because it also kind of ties in back remember when Abraham and Lot first moved back into Canaan, Their herds were too big, they couldn't live together, so Abraham, trying to be a nice guy, gives Lot the first choice as to where to go. And Lot picks the area around Sodom and Gomorrah because the grass is greener there, literally. The grass is literally greener there. Had Lot not chosen that, had he chosen the other side, then Abraham would have been where Sodom and Gomorrah was, he would have lost everything. So this kind of wraps up how Abraham actually dodged a bullet there. So let's look at verse 16. Somebody want to pick that up? This is an important story.
Abraham intercedes for Sodom.
Yeah.
The men set out from there and looked down toward Sodom. Abraham was walking with them to see them on their way.
Now down towards Sodom literally is Abraham's in the hill country. Sodom and Gomorrah have never been identified. We do know of places that were destroyed by an earthquake around the Dead Sea. There's lots of villages that this happened to. Of course, they didn't have building codes, but even if you did, an earthquake. And we do know the area is earthquake prone. Because, did I talk about the geography of Israel in here?
No.
Okay, the Jordan River, you have the Sea of Galilee. The Jordan River flows into the Sea of Galilee from the mountains. Out of the Sea of Galilee, it flows down into the Dead Sea. There is it's a rift valley. So there's the tectonic plate theory. So there's a split in the earth. It actually, that rift runs all the way into Kenya, Africa, runs through the bottom of the Dead Sea. How many people here have heard of Louis Leakey? Anybody? Louis Leakey, the anthropologist. He's one of the first guys that did the work on trying to find ancient Old Divide Gorge, where he uncovered the skeletons as part of this rift valley down in Africa. It's like a 2,000 mile long rift valley. Of course, what do we know about rifts in the Earth's surface? What happens there? And there's earthquakes. So it is a fault. The city of Jericho is built on this fault line. What happens with Joshua? The walls come tumbling down. And we do know that prior to the time of Abraham, if we're correct with our dating of Abraham, maybe several hundred years before Abraham, there was a magnitude 8 earthquake in this area. A sort of magnitude 8, given how people built back then, would have been really devastating because they built right on these fault lines. They didn't know it was a fault line. So remember, the Dead Sea is the lowest spot on the face of the earth, 1,300 feet below sea level. That's the top of the water. I'm not talking about the bottom. Top of the water is 1,300 feet below sea level. Jericho's 1,000 feet below sea level. Jerusalem's 2,000 feet above sea level. So when they're talking about going down to Sodom, they literally are going from west to east. Normally we think of going down as south, but in the Bible, going down literally means going down from a higher elevation to a lower elevation. You can literally go up to Jerusalem from north of Jerusalem. Everybody understand? So again, I know it's hard for us to wrap our heads around that because we think differently, but that's part of the unique geography of this area. It is an earthquake prone area. Okay, I'm sorry, go ahead, Jim.
The Lord reflected, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, now that he is to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations of the earth are to find blessings in him?
So that repeats, remember that was the promise in 12. Not only is Abraham going to become a nation, but he's becoming a nation, so it's universal. All the nations eventually may be blessed. Go ahead.
Indeed, I have singled him out that he may direct his sons and his posterity to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord may carry into effect for Abraham the promise he made about him. Then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grave, that I must go down and see whether or not their actions fully correspond to the cry against them that comes to me. I mean to find out.
It's interesting, if you read the book of Job, how does God find out who's doing what's wrong? The Satan, which is like a prosecuting attorney, roams the earth, and he's spying on people. Oh, this guy did something wrong, goes back and reports to God. The idea that God already knows everything is not part of this. They anthropomorphize God here quite a bit, right? So he wants to go check out. He's heard the people of Sodom and Gomorrah are very bad. So if they're bad, they deserve to be punished. So I'm going to go check it out. Go ahead.
While the two men walked on farther toward Sodom, and the Lord remained standing before Abraham, then Abraham drew nearer to him and said, will you sweep away the innocent with the guilty?
Okay, so there's a critical question. Does everybody in the city deserve to be punished? Because that questions the fairness of God. Does that make sense? And so it's bothering Abraham. Well, geez, you're gonna wipe the city out. What if there's some innocent people there? So you're gonna start questioning. Go ahead.
Suppose there were 50 innocent people in the city. Would you wipe out that place rather than spare it for the sake of the 50 innocent people within it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to make the innocent die with the guilty, so that the innocent and the guilty would be treated alike. Should not the judge of all the world act with justice?
So does everybody understand what's really going on here? Right? There's this. I mean, it's a serious question. What's happening is similar to what happened in Noah's Ark. What do we know? Natural disasters, right? So in the Old Testament time, the hurricane hits Fort Myers Beach. Everybody living there must have been a no good, rotten scumbag, and they deserved to get killed. No, that would be the thought, right? Those people must have done something terribly wrong to deserve that punishment. That would be the way in the Old Testament, especially the early part of the Old Testament, they would have been thinking. So again, it's like the Noah's Ark theme: flooding. Other natural disasters are earthquakes. Did the earthquake happen because everybody was bad, and did innocent people die in the earthquake? Because that would question the goodness of God. So this is a serious question here. Everybody got it? All right, go ahead.
The Lord replied, if I find 50 innocent people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake. Abraham spoke up again. See how I am presuming to speak to my Lord, though I am but dust and ashes. What if there are 5 less than 50 innocent people? Will you destroy the whole city because of those 5? I will not destroy it, he answered, if I find 45 there. But Abraham persisted, saying, what if only 40 are found there? He replied, I will forbear doing it for the sake of the 40. So then he said, let my Lord grow impatient if I go on. What if only 30 are found there? He replied, I will forbear doing it if I can find but 30 there. Still he went on, since I have thus dared to speak to my Lord, what if there are no more than 20? I will not destroy it, he answered, for the sake of the 20. But he still persisted. Please let not my Lord grow angry if I speak up this last time. What if there are at least 10 there? For the sake of those 10, he replied, I will not destroy it. The Lord departed as soon as he had finished speaking with Abraham, and Abraham returned home.
Okay, so what's the purpose of this dialogue? Well, there's 2 reasons behind this dialogue. One is to show you how troubling it was to people then that you had natural disasters and there's a possibility innocent people were suffering. Right? It shows you this is a question that really bothered people. Because again, they're thinking reward and punishment is here. If you take away the idea that reward and punishment is here, this becomes less of an issue. Everybody understand? Because the real reward is later on, and this world is just a test. Later, when we get to the book of wisdom, which will be maybe in a couple years, you'll see where this whole thing gets flipped around. So the purpose of them chipping away purpose number one is to show this is really a question that's bothering the author.
It still bothers us today.
Still bothers us today, right? Still bothers us today. And then it also gives God a chance to say, no, if there are innocent people there, I will destroy them. Does this make sense? So the dialogue kind of is on the fence here. It shows the human concern, but also shows that God says, no, I'm not going to kill everybody if there's innocent people there. Okay. Now you get to the two angels then go to Sodom. And what happens there? So let's go to chapter 19. So we're going to pick up the story.
Yeah.
The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night, and wash your feet."
Does this sound familiar?
Yeah.
It's just what Abraham, see, the other thing is they juxtapose the story, right? Lot is showing the same hospitality to strangers, because Lot is actually, after all, Abraham's nephew. Right, so he's showing hospitality to these strangers, just like Abraham showed hospitality. So this shows he's a good guy, and this is the reason why he's going to be saved. Because he's innocent. Go ahead.
Then you can rise early and go on your way. They said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But he urged them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house.
Okay, notice the phrase, the last man. That's not an accident. Because they're saying everybody in the town is guilty. That's why they put the last man in there. Go ahead.
And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." Lot went out of the door.
Okay, know them is another way of saying have sex with them.
Intimacy.
Sodomy, the word sodomy comes from the city of Sodom. Right? Makes sense? So now we know what the sin is. The sin is they were sexually abusing people. Go ahead.
Lot went out to the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please."
So Lot's willing to sacrifice his own daughters to protect the strangers.
"Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot, and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands, and brought Lot into the house with them, and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they were unable to find the door.
So the angels basically rescue Lot. Okay. You want to keep going now? Or?
Okay. Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here? Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of the place. For we are about to destroy this place, because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, "Up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. When morning dawned, the angel word to Lot, saying, "Get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or else you will be consumed in the punishment of the city." But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him out and left him outside the city.
So you're giving orders to evacuate, not everybody wants to go right away, right? Sound familiar? Go ahead.
When they had brought them outside, they said, "Flee for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the hills, or else you will be consumed." And Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords, your servant has found favor with you, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot flee to the hills, for fear the disaster will overtake me and I die. Look, that city is near enough to flee to, and is a little one. Let me escape there. It is not a little one, and my life will be saved." He said to them, "Very well, I grant you this favor too, and you will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken."
Okay, stop. So this is interesting. Why were Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed in the earthquake, but not this little town that was near them? Because Lot was there. So they're saying, escape across the plain, go up into the hills. Lot's saying, I can't make it. Let me go into this little town. They said, okay, go into the little town, we won't destroy that little town. So the idea was that the little town was slated to be destroyed, but it wasn't destroyed because Lot went there and Lot was considered a good man. So the Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed because everybody is evil, but the other town is saved because there's one good man and his family in that town, and that's Lot. Does everybody see the nuance? Okay, go ahead.
"Hurry, escape there, for I can do nothing until you arrive there." Therefore the city was called Zor.
Okay, and then we know the rest of the story was fire and brimstone rains down, there was an earthquake. Now, this is interesting. In biblical archaeological, there's a magazine, Bible and Archaeology. A town has been discovered north of the Dead Sea. And like I say, Sodom and Gomorrah are not mentioned outside the Bible. That doesn't mean they didn't exist, because there is physical evidence that in the area there were earthquakes, big earthquakes, around the time or just before Abraham. There was an archaeologist that discovered a town that was a walled city. As he dug down, there was a layer of where he found a lot of glass. Which is glass is made by melting sand together, right? So that there must have been a huge fire in this town, so much so that when the town was walled, and the heat just formed natural glass. Not saying the whole layer, but there's speculation this could be Sodom. So like all the other stories in the Old Testament, there's usually some physical evidence behind the story, and you can see the problem. And the problem here is, not only do you have floods as natural disasters, you have earthquakes in this area. The problem being, why is there an earthquake and everybody dies? If everybody dies, does that mean everybody was a bad person or a sinner? In their mind, that's true, and that if the town survived that was near it, there must have been good people in that town. Now, this is obviously an oversimplified way of looking at the world, right? And as you point out, Ed, it's still a troubling question. Some people would say it may be the most critical question to organized religion is, why is there evil in the world? Or why do bad things happen to good people? Right, that's still, and that probably maybe more than any other thing is what causes some people to lose their faith. Because they can't overcome that idea that, now, and later on the book of Wisdom talks about bad things happen as a test, that God is testing us because our real reward isn't here, it's only later on. But during this period when they only believed that you were rewarded and punished on this earth, it was important for them to have this story showing that no, God doesn't punish innocent people. But the book of Job is going to just completely blow that idea out of the water. Yeah, Job suffers and he is innocent. And how do we know he's innocent? Because God keeps saying he's innocent in the book, right? So eventually the book of Job was written after the exile to re-expose the problem. And it's only after they re-expose the problem, and there are prophets that are concerned in around the 500s when they see the Babylonian exile coming, do all the people in Jerusalem deserve to be punished? Some of the prophets are going to raise up this very same question all over again. Are there innocent people suffering? Habakkuk is one of those prophets. Are innocent people suffering? And that's why Job is written, to kind of expose the problem. And it's only after Job that they start to develop the idea, well, if God is fair, there must be something else to life than what we have here. And the notion of heaven and hell, which it's interesting, other religions did believe in the afterlife. The Egyptians believed in the afterlife, right? A lot of pagan religions. But the Jews didn't have a fully developed concept of the afterlife until after the exile. Everybody understand? Okay. So you have that. Then in chapter 20, this is deja vu all over again. Chapter 20, you have another story where Abraham passes his wife off as his sister. Does this sound familiar? Hey, it's a good plot. It's now that God has said that Sarah is going to have the baby, let's have one more drama in there, because if Sarah is now living with another guy, how's it going to be Abraham's baby, right? It's just to heighten the suspense. Remember, this is written like a soap opera on purpose. Right? Are they ever going to have this kid? Right? That's the function of the way the author is writing the story. He's deliberately creating a lot of drama. A lot of drama. So that when they finally have the kid, there's this sigh of relief. And then God comes in and says, kill the kid. Because it doesn't make sense. The whole thing is that it's not supposed to make sense. Because now it's a test of faith. Can you obey God when you can't explain why you should obey God? Can you just take it on faith? Again, this is why Abraham is considered a father of faith, and this is why Mary in the New Testament is considered so important. Because when she says yes to the angel, she's exposing herself to the possibility of being stoned. She has to take it on faith that God's going to work this out with Joseph and everybody else so she doesn't get killed. But the moment she says yes to the angel, she has no idea how this is going to happen. Does that make sense? That's why Mary is such an important person in the New Testament. Because Mary doesn't appear in the New Testament very many times. Right? She's in the infancy narratives and John's Gospel. She's at one miracle and she's at the foot of the cross. Throughout most of the rest of the Gospels, you never hear Mary mentioned. But she's critical because of that one incident right at the beginning. A lot like it. And you're going to see the same thing with with Jacob. When Jacob leaves eventually, in order to inherit the promise, he's got to come back. But who's waiting for him when he comes back? Esau, his brother, who wants to kill him. He's got to have faith that God will. It doesn't make sense to go back for Jacob because he's got wives, he's got kids, he's got a lot of flocks. He's living with his father-in-law. Everything is good. Why move? Well, you can't inherit the promise if you're not living in Canaan. So he has to go back, so he's got to trust that God will protect him. All those characters have to make a life and death decision. They're putting their life in God's hands. That's why they're so critical, right? They're examples of faith over and over again. And that's the way the stories are written. Okay, so you have this story of Abraham where it says about Sarah's wife, she's my sister. Remember, Abraham's 100 now, and Sarah's, 80 or 90? So it's kind of laughable in a sense, but it's just to build the drama. Okay, the birth of Isaac. We'll skip over 20. Never let a good story go to waste. Now, this happens in the Gospels too, by the way. Everybody knows the miracles of the loaves and fishes, right? It's the only miracle you find in all four Gospels. written exactly the same way. It's in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Only miracle. The miracle appears twice in Mark and Matthew. The second time Jesus multiplies loaves and fishes, they're in a deserted place. There's a lot of people. First story is in chapter 6. 2 chapters later, in chapter 8, disciples and Jesus are out in the middle of nowhere again with this big crowd. And the disciples can't figure out how we're going to feed these people.
I don't know, it doesn't make sense.
2 chapters earlier, Jesus fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves, and the apostles are so stupid they can't remember the 2 chapters earlier. Okay, so you're looking at this going, well, wait a minute. I don't care how dumb you are, or how bad your memory is, or how many senior moments you had. Out of the 12 guys, not one can remember? That just doesn't make sense. What does make sense is that Mark probably doubled up on the story. And he doubled up on the story because the first miracle took place with a Jewish group, the second miracle takes place with a Gentile group, showing that Jesus came for the Gentiles as much for the Jews. John only has 1 incident, Luke only has 1 incident, Mark and Matthew, the other one have 2. And the reaction just doesn't. So it's obvious they don't waste a good story, right? If you can use it again, use it again. They did, so. I know that seems odd to us, but again, remember, history is not that critical here. It's can God do what he says he's going to do despite all the impediments thrown in his way? Is the point. All right, so the birth of Isaac. We'll get time to read this. So we're going to pick up 21.
Birth of Isaac,
Yeah.
the Lord took note of Sarah, as he had said he would. The Lord did for her as he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time that God had stated. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son of his whom Sarah bore him.
Remember, the name Isaac really means laughter. Go ahead.
When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God had commanded. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah then said, God has given me cause to laugh, and all who hear of it will laugh with me.
And of course, that echoes the original story where she's in the tent and laughs because she's thinking it's not possible. Now she's laughing because she's happy she had a son. Remember, in those times, if a woman was barren, it was considered that she must be cursed. She must have done something wrong. When you read the story about the birth of John the Baptist, it's interesting in Luke's gospel, you can read it. John's mother, Elizabeth, even mentions that somehow God has lifted the curse from, even she saw herself as cursed at the time. Okay, go ahead.
Who would ever have told Abraham, she added, that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham held a great banquet on the day of the child's weaning.
Okay, weaning. Now, you're not, as we're told in 2nd Maccabees, I know this is kind of moving away, how long did they breastfeed? It seems like they breastfeed for about 3 years. Now, and it makes sense when you think about it. It's not that the kid wasn't eating solid food as well, but there are no bottles, there's no formula, so you would have to breastfeed longer. So we learned in 2nd Maccabees that that's about, it seems about 3 years old. So he's having this party, the kid's 3. And this is important also for Moses. Because Moses, remember, is given back to his mother, which the Pharaoh's daughter doesn't know it's his mother, right? But then he's weaned. This way, so this means Moses was with his own mother until he was 3 years old. So even though he's raised by the Egyptians, by the time you're 3, you kind of know some things, you know who your mom is and all that, right? So later on, when Moses appears on the scene and there's an Egyptian overseer beating a Hebrew slave, he kills the overseer. Moses knows he's a Hebrew. Now the problem is when the movie The Ten Commandments and some of these movies, it's like he's shocked to find out he's a Hebrew. No, that's not what the Bible says. When he appears later on as an adult, they jump from when he's weaned to when he's adult, he already knows he's Hebrew. He's not stunned to find out he's a Hebrew. Because the weaning probably took place over 3 years. So it's kind of safe to think that now Isaac is 3 years old. Does that everybody understand? Go ahead.
Sarah noticed the son whom Hagar, the Egyptian, had born to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac.
So now, this Hagar's son is about 18, right? Because he was born 15 years before Isaac, and it's 3 years later, so he's about 18 years old, and he's playing with his little brother who's 3. Remember, Sarah originally had Hagar kicked out of the camp when she was pregnant, and then God sent her back, have the baby. So now Hagar and Ishmael have been living with Sarah and Abraham all these years. Keep going.
So she demanded of Abraham, drive out that slave and her son. No son of that slave is going to share the inheritance with my son Isaac. Abraham was greatly distressed because it concerned a son of his. But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed about the boy or about your slave woman. Obey Sarah, no matter what she asks of you, for it is through Isaac that descendants will bear your name. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, since he too is your offspring.
Okay, what Sarah's worried about is this. According to the rules in the ancient Near East, the oldest son pretty much inherited almost everything. And then the rest of the kids got the scraps. The oldest son, and we'll see this in the promise made to Jacob, right? He becomes the next patriarch. So Sarah's concerned because, hey, technically Ishmael is the firstborn, not her firstborn. And this is where the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews separate. See, the Muslims see Ishmael as they are descendant from Abraham through Ishmael. In their religion, when Abraham takes Ishmael and Hagar out of the camp and goes south, they go to Mecca. Well, Abraham and Ishmael build a shrine to God. That is the shrine that now is worshipped by the Muslims, the Kaaba. After it's built to the only one true God. After Ishmael died, the shrine is eventually taken over by pagans who worship multiple gods. When Muhammad comes along in 610 and starts to have visions, he belongs to the tribe that's actually in charge of the shrine, and there are people doing pilgrimages to the shrine. Muhammad starts to have these visions about Angel Gabriel that no, the shrine was originally built by Abraham and his son. The shrine is supposed to be the only one true God, not to the multiple gods, and Muhammad tries to, then his mission is to purge the shrine of the other gods, just bring it back to the one true God. So Muhammad sees himself as not starting a new religion. Muhammad sees himself as bringing the religion back to its original intention, was Abraham and Ishmael, the shrine, the one true God. Am I making some sense here? It's not Islam, in his mind, is not a new religion. And in fact, a lot of people don't know this. Muslims recognize the Old and New Testament as inspired. But the parts that disagree with the Quran are where the Jews and the Christians have corrupted the book. So while the book's inspired, part of it has been corrupted, and part of the corruption was that Ishmael is really the firstborn son, not Isaac. He's the one true one to inherit the promise, not Isaac. And it's Ishmael that Abraham was going to sacrifice on the mountain, not Isaac. Isaac is only born to Abraham because he was willing to sacrifice Ishmael. Is this kind of show you where the Muslim religion is tied in here?
But did they have a reason for
For what?
believing in Ishmael's name?
Yeah, because Muhammad received visions. Muhammad was meditate in a cave. He received these visions. Obviously, in that part of the country, people must have been very familiar with the Old Testament and New Testament stories, because the Quran itself, 25% of the Quran can be directly tied to some Jewish or Christian literature. Moses is mentioned in the Quran more than any other man. So when you read the Quran, there are constant references to Old Testament stories. They don't retell the story. They just reference the story, which means people must have been familiar with the story. So they'll say, remember Moses and Pharaoh, right? But they won't tell you the story of the plagues. The assumption is everybody knows the story. So that means at the time, Jen, am I making sense here? At the time in Arabia, the Old Testament and New Testament must have been well known. In other words, there were a lot of Jews and Christians around in that area. So that Muhammad, when he has these visions, sees himself as kind of cleaning up the religion. See, the Christians are considered polytheists because they believe there are three persons in one God. Only the Jews were considered real monotheists by the Muslims. And Muhammad saw the Jews as his natural allies because they are true monotheists just like the Muslims. And then he was disappointed when they wouldn't join him in going back to fight against the people of Mecca. Am I making sense? So my point is, and there's a scholar in Notre Dame, Gabriel Reynolds, who's done a lot of work with the connection between Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, and Islam. And he has published a book that's the Quran, and it's annotated with every place in the Quran where you can find elements that there were Christian writings or Jewish writings behind that. Not just out of the Bible, but even the Quran even mentions stories from the books that are pseudepigrapha. The books that didn't make it into the Bible, the Quran even mentions some of those stories, like the story about Jesus as a kid, who did miracles as a kid, some of the infancy gospel of Thomas, some of that stuff is even in the Quran. So those stories must have been really well known in 610 AD in the Arabian Peninsula. Because they're just, like I said, they're just referenced, they're not retold. And the name Moses does appear in the Quran more than any other person's name. It's kind of ironic how you think of it. Moses, Noah, Sodom and Gomorrah. So the stories in the Quran that appear a lot are the stories where you better do the right thing, otherwise, look what happened to the people of Noah's time, look what happened to the Egyptians, look at what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. The Quran really goes back to these stories a lot because they're trying to convince people, if you do the right thing, you'll be okay. If you don't do the right thing, here's what's going to happen. So they reference these stories over and over and over again without retelling the story. Everybody understand what I'm saying? Okay. So this sets then the stage for the final act, which is kill your son. So we're kind of at the point of done an hour. I know I've thrown a lot of stuff at you. I'm sorry to give you all this back. But when you get the background information, a lot of the other stuff starts to, does everybody just make sense? The other pieces start to fall into place the more of the background information you have. So then you have the testing of Abraham in 22. I mean, you guys want to do this one now? It's not very long. How many people have you? Another 5 minutes or so? Yes or no?
Yes.
It's up to you guys. Okay. I'll read it, so make it fast. So chapter 22. Sometime after these events, God put Abraham to the test. So we don't really know how old Isaac was at this point, but old enough to walk and talk. So he called Abraham, ready, he replied. Then God said, take your son Isaac, your only one whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. Now, the assumption here is that the land of Moriah is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which of course has no temple on it at this point, it's just a mountain.
Why did he say only son?
Because the other one's been disowned. And the Bible's trying to make it clear that Isaac is now the only son. The other one's been disowned, so he can't inherit. Does that make sense? The Muslims would, of course, disagree. They would say, no, it's the other way around, that this Ishmael is really the firstborn son. There you will offer him as a holocaust on the height I will point out. Now, Holocaust is there are multiple different kinds of sacrifices. The Holocaust is you burn the victim up completely. You kill it and just burn the whole body. That's why the Holocaust was called the Holocaust. Everybody understand? That makes sense?
Yeah.
Because how did they get rid of the bodies? They burned them because it was a much faster way of getting rid of the bodies than trying to bury them. So that's why you had the ovens and all that. And that's why the Holocaust is called the Holocaust, because the bodies are completely reduced to ashes. Where am I? Okay. Early the next morning, Abraham saddled his donkey, which he would have, donkeys, not camels, back then. Took with him his son Isaac, 2 of his servants as well, and with the wood that he had cut for the Holocaust, set out the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham got sight of the place from afar. Then he said to the servants, both of you stay here with the donkey while the boy and I go on yonder. We will worship and then come back to you. Thereupon Abraham took the wood for the Holocaust, laid it on his son Isaac's shoulders, while he himself carried the fire and the knife. Interesting parallel here to the idea of the son carrying the wood, Jesus carrying the cross. As the two walked on, Isaac spoke to his father Abraham, Father. Yes, son, replied Isaac, continue, here are the fire and the wood, but where is the sheep for the Holocaust? Son, Abraham answered, God himself will provide the sheep for the Holocaust, and the two continued on going forward. And of course, spoiler alert, God does provide the sheep. Well, not in a way that Abraham was expecting. When they came to the place in which God had told him, Abraham built an altar there, arranged the wood on it. Next he tied up his son Isaac and put him on top of the wood on the altar. At this point, the kids are going to say, I would have run away. I said, nah. Back then, kids had no rights. This was it. Now, you have to remember, child sacrifice was a part of the ancient Near East. God asking Abraham to sacrifice his son wouldn't have seemed by Abraham to have been an odd request. He would not have been upset for the same reason we're upset. We're thinking, how could God ask sacrifice? Child sacrifice was a part of religion in the ancient Near East. People sacrificed their children. It was a weird, and then I say to the kids, and we think we're advanced today, we've killed how many people in the last 50 years? 66 million? So before we condemn them for killing kids, our society isn't much better. In fact, you would say, we're worse off. So, what would be so astounding to Abraham would be, I'm killing the child that was the fulfillment of the promise. And whose promise was it? It was God's promise. So Abraham is being put in a very peculiar position here, between a rock and a hard place. It really doesn't make sense for him to kill his son Isaac, because it makes it look like he's breaking God's promise for him. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
It does?
Well, because God had promised him he would be the head of all nations.
Right, but now he's going to kill the kid that he's going to have his descendants through. You can't be the head of all of the nation with your own family if you don't have a family.
Right.
Ishmael is disowned, right? So now Isaac is the bearer of the promise, and yet God seems to be breaking his promise. Doesn't make sense to kill the kid. On the other hand, it also doesn't make sense to not obey God, because in every story, every time Abraham obeys God, what happens? Things eventually turn out okay. So you're like, Abraham is being put in a position where you can't make a rational decision here.
Just trust.
You have to show complete trust. On the one hand, it doesn't make sense to do it. On the other hand, it doesn't make sense not to do it. I don't think this is a position that any of us, think about this, we would not want to be put in this position. Right? This is a tough spot to be put in. And that's why Abraham is considered a father of faith, because you can't rationalize why you should do it. Does this make sense? So, then he reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son, but the Lord's messenger called him and said, Abram, Abram, yes, Lord, do not lay your hand on the boy. And as we know, what happens is they find a ram in the thicket, and they take that and sacrifice it. It was only a test. God never meant for him to sacrifice his son, and he just wanted to see would Abraham do it. Later on in the book of Deuteronomy and the book of Leviticus, there are clear rules against child sacrifice. The Jews were not allowed to sacrifice children. They did it under some of the later kings. They did introduce child sacrifice, and the prophets, why did they do it? Why do we generally do anything that's not right? Because everybody else is doing it and getting away with it. So some of the later kings looked around, other people are performing child sacrifice, they seem to be doing just fine, why don't we do it too? The later prophets then went berserk. No, you're not supposed to do this, right? And this is one of the reasons why a prophet like Jeremiah would say God is going to cause the Babylonian exile. Because the kings did something so terrible that he's got to punish you. There's no way of getting around this. You did something that was awful. You killed your own children. So we know child sacrifice is a major part of summary. The Phoenicians were big on child sacrifice, and that is the Phoenicians, later on the Romans, the Punic War. The Carthaginians were Phoenicians. Did you guys know that? Carthage was a Phoenician city. Are you familiar with Roman history?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So Hannibal and all those people, they actually are Phoenicians. The Phoenicians had cities all around the Mediterranean. They were the sea traders. And they were the ones that brought in metals that went all the way to Cornwall in England to get tin, because you needed tin to put with copper to make bronze. And they were big on child sacrifice. So Hannibal and all those people were actually Phoenicians.
If it was commonplace to kill children, how did they decide it was wrong? How did they learn it was wrong?
The Hebrews are the ones that, in the Hebrew law, was considered wrong. But even the Romans, you know, even at the time of Christ, if a Roman father did not want to keep a child, they would either get an abortion, or they would put the child out on the doorstep and expose it and just abandon it.
Up on the
Because
wall.
when you read the Didache, everybody familiar? There was the first catechism written about 100 AD, about the time of John's Gospel, explicitly forbids abortion and child sacrifice. So the idea that you're not supposed to kill your children through abortion goes way back into the early church. People who try to say it's a more recent teaching are full of, it's in black and white. I mean, it's as clear can be.
That's right.
Because other cultures were doing this. So, again, the whole point of the story is, it doesn't make sense. Does that make sense? Does it make sense that it doesn't make sense? If it makes sense that it doesn't make sense, then you understand it. But that's the point. The point is, it can't be a test of faith unless it's nonsensical. Now, my first year teaching, I don't know who wrote the book on the Old Testament. I got rid of it the very first year I was teaching, because when I read this section, person who wrote the book said, Abraham must have misunderstood God. God would never have asked Abraham to sacrifice his child. And I'm going, you better read the passage. That's not what it says. And if you say that God didn't ask Abraham to sacrifice his child, you completely take away the point that Abraham is the follower of faith. It's making that choice that makes him the follower. You know, it's choosing to obey God when it doesn't make sense. That's when you show your faith. So there's a tendency to take these stories in the Old Testament that don't sit well with us, right? And people try to find a way around the story. When you find your way around the story, you tend to destroy the meaning of the story. Because again, you got to put yourself back in that culture. You know, we tend to judge from our own culture. You know, so Thomas Jefferson is a bad guy now, right? But a lot of these people that think that, if they were living back then at the time of Jefferson,
It's okay.
what makes them think they would be so virtuous, right? Because they're not in that situation. It's always easy to judge history from a distance because you're like I said, who would want to be put in Abraham's shoes and have to make that choice? I mean, think about that. I mean, I don't know if I could have done it. Honestly. That's why these people are great. And we're following them, not the other way around.
He was chosen.
Right?
He was chosen.
Yeah. But he still had to make the choice to do it. Just like Mary was chosen full of grace, but she still had, there's this idea we're given grace, but you still have to respond.
Right.
Right? The response is critical.
That's the greatness.
You know. Okay, so next week, real quickly, we'll go, any questions about the Abraham stories? We'll jump ahead to chapter 24. Where am I? Chapter 24. You don't have to read that whole chapter. Wait a minute. Should look at this. Abraham marries another wife in chapter 25, and that accounts for why there's all these other people around. So he's over 100 years old, he's having more kids. Obviously it's fictional, but then you have the descendants of Ishmael. That accounts for where all these other people come from and live around there. Okay, just go to jump over that. Go to chapter 25, verse 19. This is what sets up the birth of Jacob and Esau. Okay, so look at that 19, and read to the end of chapter 19, and then skip 26. I like to read all this, but we never get out of Genesis. And go to chapter 27, Jacob's deception. So again, just to repeat, you're looking at 25:19 through the end of the chapter, which is what, 34. And then 27. Interesting story. Any questions on what we did today? Anything?
It's Sodom and Gomorrah one city or two?
Two.
They always talk about Sodom.
Yeah. They only mentioned Sodom. they only went to Sodom, but it was supposedly so, well, what happened probably, Jan, was there was an earthquake in an area, there were several cities. When we talk about cities, we're not talking about like New York or something, you know, you're talking, their populations weren't very big, even if it was a walled city, they weren't that big. Yeah, and so a number of towns are destroyed, but one survives. So in their mind, the towns that are destroyed, everybody must have been bad, but the towns that survived, there must have been some good people there. That's why they were spared. That's what the story's all about. Okay?
Yep.
See you guys next. Thanks for coming. Hopefully it worked. Hour and 15 minutes, okay.